There are confessions that don't sound like apologies. They sound like hymns. Keith Urban's came softly, no headlines, no pyrotechnics, just a man in a dim Nashville room, letting the truth stretch its legs for the first time. He didn't talk about scandals. He talked about love and how it changes shape. The blue-eyed golden boy of country leather boots, lightning on a fretboard, looked back at the mirror long enough to notice the face had lines and the heart had weather. I loved her more than I knew how to, he admitted, not as a plea, but as a key turning in an old lock. To the outside world, Keith and Nicole were a fairy tale carved into marble. Two continents, one altar, cameras blooming like flowers. But fame is a terrarium. It asks love to breathe without oxygen. He toured. She filmed. They were together beneath chandeliers and apart beneath time zones. Somewhere between the roar of stadiums and the silence of hotel rooms, love learned to whisper. Not absence evolution. Tonight the room is small. A single lamp turns the air to honey. He tunes by feel, not sound, like a man who finally trusts his hands again. No armor, no performance. Perfection, he'd tell a friend, is the loneliest cage I ever built. He speaks of seasons, not endings, of grace, not blame. The boy from Caboolture, who once thought applause was oxygen, now chases something quieter, honesty that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. A journalist on the porch later will call his words a benediction. A fan in the cheap seats will just call it permission to let what was beautiful become gentle, to let gratitude be the last chord. The camera doesn't blink. Keith doesn't either. The guitar hums like a living thing, and, for once, the silence after the note is the point. For decades, Keith Urban was the luminous heart of modern country music, the man who made heartbreak sound holy. From his first chords on the Nashville circuit to his reign as one of the genre's most electrifying stars, he carried the kind of charisma that could make a crowd of 50,000 feel like a living, breathing heartbeat. His story shimmered with everything the world loves to mythologize. The self-made musician, the romantic hero, the man who rose from dusty small-town obscurity to share both a stage and a life with one of Hollywood's most radiant icons, Nicole Kidman. Their love looked flawless under the flash of cameras, the country boy and the Oscar-winning queen. To fans, they embodied balance, grit, and grace, roots and refinement. To tabloids, they were an eternal headline. But as the years unfolded, the glow around them began to resemble a mirage, beautiful but fading at the edges. Because in truth, Keith Urban was not simply a celebrity basking in applause. He was a man haunted by his own echoes, a perfectionist raised on the sharp edge between humility and hunger. Those who've worked with him describe two Keiths. One, the tireless craftsman, endlessly rehearsing, chasing tone through sleepless nights, every string bent towards some invisible ideal. The other, the soul searcher, gentle, almost fragile when the lights go down, the kind of man who apologizes even when he doesn't have to. It was this second Keith who met Nicole in 2005, a man in love with music but still learning how to love himself. Nicole Kidman, too, was no stranger to the cost of devotion. Her world of film sets, scripts, and unrelenting expectation mirrored Keith's own high-wire act in another form. Both of them understood the loneliness of success. Both knew that sometimes the biggest rooms are the quietest. When their paths crossed at a charity gala in Los Angeles, the connection was instantaneous. A glance, a smile, the kind of chemistry that feels predestined. She didn't see the fame, Keith would say later. She saw the man underneath. And yet, as with most great love stories, the beauty came threaded with pain. Fame doesn't destroy love in one blow. It erodes it gently, like tide against stone. The schedules, the distances, the relentless scrutiny each played its part. But what kept them together for nearly 2 decades was not perfection, but grace. Nicole's steadfastness when Keith entered rehab in 2006 saved him not through force, but faith. She believed in me when I couldn't, he said. That's love, not the red carpets, not the fairy tale. Just that. From the outside, it all looked like victory. Albums went platinum, tours sold out. Nicole's performances earned Oscars and Emmys. Together, they built a family that became the envy of the world. But behind that serene public front, something deeper and quieter was changing. Keith began to shift his gaze inward, toward a kind of peace that fame could never offer. His music reflected it, songs less about fireworks, more about forgiveness. The Keith who once wrote to impress was now writing to heal. By the time he turned 57, the storm inside him had settled. He no longer sought applause as proof of worth. He sought silence as proof of peace. So when he finally spoke, not through PR statements or interviews, but through song and confession, it felt like a culmination. A closing of one book, not a breaking of vows. His truth wasn't scandalous, it was human. Love, he said softly, changes. It doesn't vanish. It just finds another way to exist. And perhaps that is what makes Keith Urban's story different. It's not about downfall or redemption in the traditional sense. It's about evolution, the kind that strips away the glamour until all that's left is a man with a guitar, a memory, and the courage to let both live freely. Somewhere in the quiet outskirts of Nashville, as the cicadas hum through another Tennessee dusk, Keith still strums beneath golden light, not for applause, not for legend, but for truth. Because every chord, every silence between notes is still him telling the world, I'm here. I made it through. Long before the fame, before the golden arenas and the tabloid myths, there was just a boy barefoot, curious, and trembling with sound. Keith Lionel Urban was born on the 26th of October, 1967, in the small harbor city of Whangarei, New Zealand. But his true story began across the Tasman Sea in the humble working-class town of Caboolture, Queensland, where red dust clung to everything and dreams were often considered luxuries. His father, Robert Urban, was a gentleman with calloused hands who sold instruments part-time. His mother, Marianne, adored American country records. Their modest home pulsed with the heartbeat of Nashville long before Keith ever knew where Tennessee was. On Saturday nights, Glenn Campbell and Don Williams filled the living room, and the boy would sit close to the speakers as if the songs were speaking directly to him. He once said, "Those voices didn't just sing, they painted pictures of lives I hadn't lived yet." At 4, he picked up a ukulele. At 6, a guitar. It wasn't talent that impressed his parents. At first, it was the obsession. He played until his fingers bled, then wrapped them in tape and played again. When his father told him, if you want the world to listen, make it feel you, Keith took it as a kind of gospel. But school was never the sanctuary music was. He was shy, awkward, and often the target of jokes for his accent or his cowboy songs. While other boys played rugby under the punishing Queensland sun, Keith hid away in the living room, rewinding cassette tapes to catch a single guitar lick from Chet Atkins. Teachers thought he was distracted. His classmates thought he was strange. Only the guitar understood his language. Music, he'd later say, was the only thing I didn't stutter in. At 9, he began entering local talent contests, small stages in dusty halls, where the prize was sometimes just applause. His voice was gentle, almost fragile, but it carried honesty. The judges noticed, as did the neighbors who would gather outside his family's window to listen. Marianne beamed with pride, and Robert, quietly convinced his son had something rare, made a decision that would change everything. When Keith was 12, Robert mortgaged their modest house to buy him a professional-grade guitar, a gamble few fathers would dare. "Make it count," he said simply. Keith never forgot those words. From that day, the instrument became more than a tool. It became a promise. He practiced until his arms cramped, memorizing every nuance of tone, bending strings until he could make them weep or whisper. While friends discovered parties and teenage rebellion, Keith discovered tone and texture. The loneliness that might have broken other kids instead carved depth into him. Each night, when Caboolture's streets fell silent, faint music would drift from the Urban's house, a boy teaching himself how to turn solitude into melody. At 15, he began playing in local bars. The venues were smoky, loud, and indifferent. He was too young to drink, but too serious to be dismissed. Standing on sticky floors before strangers who barely listened, he learned one of life's hardest lessons: how to give everything, even when no one seems to care. Years later, he described those nights as his true schooling. "That's where I found out whether I was chasing fame or chasing truth," he said. The answer came quietly. It wasn't applause he craved, it was connection. A moment when the air between him and an audience felt charged, alive. He learned to make sadness sound beautiful, to turn heartache into rhythm. Those empty bars became laboratories of empathy, where he tested what emotion could survive when stripped of everything artificial. By 17, Keith had outgrown the small-town stage. His friends were taking apprenticeships, finding steady work. He packed a suitcase, slung his guitar over his shoulder, kissed his mother's cheek, hugged his father tightly, and whispered, "I'll make it worth it." He left Caboolture not with certainty, but with hunger, the kind that keeps a dream alive even when reality insists it shouldn't. Years later, when a journalist asked what he remembered most about that moment, he said, "The road didn't scare me. Staying the same did. Same old cell, including to be play." He didn't know it then, but that hunger, equal parts faith and fear, would define his life. Nashville was still just a word, a mythical place on the other side of the world. What he carried instead was something rarer than luck, the belief that music could save him. In those early years, his story unfolded like the verses of a country song: hardship, hope, repetition. But beneath it all was a tenderness that set him apart. While other aspiring musicians were busy imitating, Keith was listening not just to notes, but to the silences between them. He once described music as a mirror that doesn't lie. Even as a boy, he was already trying to find the reflection that felt true. He wouldn't find it yet. Not in Caboolture, not in Australia. The dream waiting for him across the ocean would test everything he believed about art, ambition, and the price of success. But for now, the boy with the calloused fingers and the impossible faith kept strumming beneath the soft hum of cicadas, rehearsing for a world that didn't know his name yet. The real story of rise, ruin, and resurrection was only beginning. The day Keith Urban stepped off the plane in Nashville, the air felt different, heavier somehow, soaked in heat and hope. He was 24, broke, and completely certain that this was where he belonged. In his suitcase, a few shirts, a battered guitar, and a map covered in hand-drawn stars marking the places where country dreams were born. "I thought the streets would hum with songs," he once said. "And they did, but they were being played by 1,000 guys just like me." Nashville in the early 1990 seconds was a battlefield disguised as a town. Every bar, every open mic was a war for attention. The air smelled of beer and desperation. The young Australian kid with the shy smile and perfect pitch was easy to overlook at first. He wasn't part of the system. He didn't have the twang, the accent, or the pedigree, but he had something else: persistence that bordered on obsession. He spent nights recording demos for other singers, playing backup guitar for artists who barely noticed him, sleeping in apartments so small that the hum of the refrigerator became percussion. There were times when he sold his instruments to pay rent, only to buy them back days later with borrowed cash. But no matter how deep the struggle, the music inside him refused to die. "It's not ambition that keeps you alive," he said later. "It's hunger, pure hunger." He found kindred spirits in two other struggling musicians, and together they formed The Ranch. The name sounded bold, but in truth they were three dreamers, running on fumes and cheap whiskey. They played anywhere that would have them: smoky dive bars, county fairs, dusty backroom stages where the applause came from drunk strangers who just wanted another song before last call. The crowds were small, the pay smaller, but the energy Keith brought to those sets was enormous. He performed as if the universe itself was listening, pouring every note into the air like a prayer. "You learn who you are on those nights," he said once. "You learn whether you're doing this for love or applause." And each night, he chose love. The Ranch released a self-titled album in 1997, a critical gem that went largely unnoticed commercially, but marked Keith's first real step toward identity. Reviewers began whispering about him: the Australian kid who plays like lightning but sings like heartbreak. It wasn't the breakthrough yet, but it was the crack in the wall. Still, behind the music, a different rhythm was building, one of exhaustion and quiet despair. The road was merciless, the competition endless, and the loneliness gnawed at him. To numb the ache, he reached for the bottle. At first it was celebration, then ritual, then dependence. "The loneliness of the road," he later confessed, "can make a man believe the wrong things love him." Then, in 1999, everything changed. Keith's American debut album, simply titled Keith Urban, hit radio like a confession wrapped in melody. It wasn't traditional country, nor was it pop. It was raw, tender, electric, his own hybrid language. But for the grace of God and where the blacktop ends became anthems for dreamers who felt like outsiders. The critics called him the new face of country, but what they really meant was that he sounded human. Suddenly, the boy from Caboolture was everywhere. The Academy of Country Music crowned him top new male vocalist. The CMA handed him the Horizon Award. Fans flooded arenas. Radio stations couldn't stop spinning his songs. He had arrived, or so it seemed. But fame, as he would later say, is just a louder kind of loneliness. The industry that had ignored him for years now demanded perfection. Every lyric was dissected, every performance measured against impossible expectations. The louder the applause grew, the quieter his peace became. The very hunger that had once driven him began to devour him. Nights stretched into mornings filled with self-doubt and the burn of another drink. His friends noticed the change. The energy was still there, but the laughter came with shadows. He worked endlessly, chasing a sound that could satisfy both the critics and the ghost inside him, whispering, "Not enough, not yet." And then, as if written by fate itself, came the night that changed everything. Los Angeles, 2005. A charity gala. Stars everywhere, but none shone brighter than the tall porcelain figure gliding through the crowd, Nicole Kidman. She was elegance personified, all restraint, all light. He approached her awkwardly, voice soft, smile unsure. "I'm Keith," he said, like a man confessing a secret. She smiled back with warmth that felt like mercy. She didn't see the fame, Keith would say later. She saw the man underneath. That encounter became the spark for the next chapter, the one that would define both his art and his life. It was the meeting of two people who had spent years being worshipped by millions, yet quietly drowning alone. They recognized something familiar in each other's silence. From that moment on, Keith's music changed. The lyrics softened, the edges blurred, the songs no longer roared, they reached. Love became both muse and medicine. "I started writing not from pain," he said, "but from possibility." But love, as always, has its own tempo. And Keith's old demons still kept time. His romance with Nicole bloomed against the backdrop of his deepening addiction, a double exposure of grace and chaos. In the years to come, this love would save him, nearly destroy him, and ultimately define him. For now, though, the stage was set. Nashville's lost son had finally conquered America. Yet behind the spotlight, a quieter story was beginning, one that no hit song could disguise. The war between the man he showed the world and the man he was still trying to forgive. By the mid-2000s, Keith Urban wasn't just a name, he was an empire wrapped in melody. His songs had become gospel for dreamers and lovers alike, and his concerts were less performances than pilgrimages. He could make a stadium feel like a confession booth. The blue-eyed boy from Caboolture had evolved into the global ambassador of country music's modern soul, blending rock's fire, pop's shimmer, and country's aching truth into something entirely his own. His second major album, Golden Road 2002, launched him into the stratosphere. Tracks like Somebody Like You and You'll Think of Me burned through radio stations across the world. The songs were radiant, full of passion, threaded with a kind of joyful melancholy. "He plays like he's on fire," one critic wrote, "but sings like he's already burned." By 2004, Keith was collecting awards faster than he could polish them: Male Vocalist of the Year, Album of the Year, Entertainer of the Year. He was country's golden prince, its crossover savior. And yet, the irony was brutal. The more the world adored him, the less he recognized the man they were clapping for. "I was on stage every night, smiling, grateful. But there were moments," he later admitted, "when I felt like I was performing inside a cage made of sound." That cage, however, didn't stop him from creating some of the most emotionally charged music of his career. Then came Be Here in 2004, an album that shimmered with devotion and introspection. Songs like Days Go By and Making Memories of Us cemented him as both a hitmaker and a poet. The album sold millions, but what it really did was turn Keith Urban into something rarer, a musician who could speak to the human condition without hiding behind genre. He toured relentlessly, often performing to sold-out arenas in 30 cities back-to-back. The smile never wavered, the energy never faltered. But offstage, the toll was immense. The long nights, the endless travel, the loneliness that fame never cures, they fed the same addiction he thought he'd left behind. "It's hard to come down from that kind of noise," he said. "When the lights go out, you have to face the silence, and that silence can be deafening." Then, in 2005, the universe placed Nicole Kidman in his path again. This time not as a fleeting encounter, but as a turning point. She was Hollywood royalty, luminous and controlled, a woman who had walked through her own fire and survived. Keith, with his quiet sincerity and rough-edged charm, became the antithesis of the world she lived in. Together, they looked like balance incarnate. Her grace, his grit, her stillness, his storm. The relationship bloomed fast and fierce. And for the first time in years, Keith began to believe he could outrun his ghosts. His songs softened, they spoke of redemption and belonging. The upcoming album, Love, Pain, and the Whole Crazy Thing, 2006, was born in that glow, an album that critics hailed as his masterpiece. It was both confession and celebration, a portrait of a man rediscovering tenderness after years of turbulence. But just months after the wedding that captivated the world, that golden evening in Sydney, where candlelight flickered off sandstone and violins melted into the night, the headlines hit like thunder. Keith Urban enters rehab. The story wasn't scandal. It was survival. Behind the newlywed smiles was a man still haunted by the ghosts of his own ambition. The pressure, the scrutiny, the self-doubt, they had all come crashing back. But what happened next rewrote the narrative. Nicole didn't leave. She stayed, quietly, unwaveringly. She refused interviews, turned down roles, and stood by his side through the recovery. When he emerged, sober and steady, he told the world, "She saved my life, not by fixing me, but by believing in me." It was perhaps the most vulnerable statement ever made by a man who'd built a career on strength. From that moment, Keith Urban's art changed permanently. His next albums, Defying Gravity, 2009, and Get Closer, 2010, were love letters set to melody. The titles themselves were metaphors for his own rebirth. Gone was the reckless prodigy. In his place stood a man who had fought his way back from the edge and chosen peace. But fame is never content to let its heroes rest. The couple became magnets for attention, photographed at airports, red carpets, award shows, family outings, their every expression dissected, their smiles measured for authenticity. They tried to build an ordinary life within the extraordinary, raising their daughters in Nashville while balancing careers that spanned continents. Through it all, Keith continued to write. Only now, his lyrics weren't about desire or triumph. They were about grace, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause. Stupid Boy, Once in a Lifetime, Blue Ain't Your Color. Each carried the fingerprint of a man who'd learned the anatomy of heartbreak and healing. People think country music is about sadness, he told Rolling Stone. It's not, it's about truth. Sadness just happens to tell it better. By 2015, he was not only a fixture of Nashville, he was its conscience. He'd mentored younger artists, served as a judge on American Idol, and become a respected elder statesman of the genre. His guitar work was still virtuosic, his performances still electric. But there was a gentleness now, a humility that only comes after nearly losing everything. Even as the public kept projecting perfection onto the couple, Keith understood what the cameras couldn't see. Love under the spotlight ages differently. It fades in increments, quietly, the way twilight becomes night. Yet what made his story remarkable wasn't tragedy, it was evolution. He didn't let the pain define him. He turned it into prayer. In a rare interview toward the end of the decade, he said something that captured the quiet revolution inside him. I stopped chasing perfection. It's overrated. What matters is showing up for the people you love, for the music, for yourself. The golden boy had become the sage. The man who once played like fire had learned to burn softly. The world still called him a star, but Keith Urban had finally learned to be something more elusive, a man at peace with imperfection. The applause was still loud, but this time he didn't need it to feel alive. Fame rarely ends with a bang. More often, it fades in whispers, the kind of quiet that creeps in between tour dates, behind perfect smiles, and inside the spaces between two people who once believed forever could outsing the noise. For Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman, that silence began softly, almost imperceptibly. There were no public fights, no fiery interviews, no scandal to feed the tabloids, just a gradual drifting, the gentle erosion of rhythm. It's strange, Keith would later say in a reflective interview. You can love someone completely and still wake up one day realizing you've both changed, like two songs that no longer share the same key. By the late 2010 seconds, their schedules had become a maze of missed connections. Nicole was shooting Big Little Lies in California, later The Undoing in New York, while Keith toured relentlessly across continents. They called daily, sent messages, FaceTimed with the kids, but digital love has its limits. He once joked, "Wi-Fi isn't intimacy." Behind the humor was truth. Friends close to them began to notice the distance. At gatherings, they were warm but formal, almost delicate around each other. There was no bitterness, only a quiet nostalgia, the sort that comes when two souls start to honor what was rather than fight for what is. They still adored each other, a mutual friend would say. They just started to live parallel lives. But the world, forever hungry for drama, began to write its own story. Rumors surfaced of separation, of emotional exhaustion, of love lost to time. Yet what unfolded wasn't a scandal. It was something more tragic, the slow, graceful death of a fairy tale. For Keith, the unraveling hit hardest not in headlines, but in the mirror. The man who had once filled stadiums now found himself waking up in hotel rooms where silence felt heavier than applause. He admitted in one interview, "I used to need the stage to feel real. Now I just needed to feel anything." And the thing about heartbreak at middle age is that it's quieter but deeper. It doesn't throw things or slam doors. It just lingers. He began writing again, but the songs were different. Gone were the anthems of youthful fire. In their place came whispers, stripped down acoustic confessions with titles like Parallel Lines and Everybody Hurts. Fans noticed the change immediately. "He sounds like he's praying, not performing," one review said. Nicole, too, seemed to be shedding skins. Her roles turned darker, rawer women unraveling, women surviving. Her performance in Big Little Lies as a wife trapped between love and loss felt like more than acting. It felt like truth disguised as fiction. "Art imitates life," she once said softly when asked about the role. Sometimes too well. As they both navigated their own awakenings, the distance grew. They weren't fighting, they were evolving separately. Love had not vanished, it had simply changed its form. Keith would describe it later as the bittersweet grace of letting go before the world forces you to. Still, there was pain. Nights when he'd walk off stage to a hotel room that felt too large. Mornings when he'd scroll through photos of his family and feel the sting of everything unsaid. He told a close friend, "It's not the loneliness that hurts, it's the remembering." Then came the press questions, relentless, sharp, often cruel. "Are you and Nicole still together? Is it over?" He would smile gently and deflect. "We're good," he'd say. But behind the practiced calm, the truth was settling in. Sometimes love outlives the relationship it was born in. By 2023, the silence was impossible to ignore. Fewer red carpets, fewer public appearances together. The fans, the media, the world all began to speculate, but Keith, now 57, had no interest in spectacle. He chose dignity over drama. When asked directly, Nicole gave a single answer that broke hearts around the world. "He will always be my family. That's all I'll ever say." And that was the tragedy. Not betrayal, not bitterness, but grace. Two people who had survived everything, fame, addiction, distance, now facing the quiet truth that love sometimes completes its purpose long before it ends. Keith spoke about it later in one of his most haunting interviews, sitting alone in a candlelit studio. "I used to think love meant holding on, but I think now it's knowing when to let go and still wishing them peace." It was not a lyric. It was a eulogy not for the relationship, but for the illusion that forever must look like permanence. He poured that realization into his music. One song in particular, "The Hard Way Home," became a quiet sensation among fans. No production, no studio polish, just his voice, cracked and human, whispering about forgiveness without naming names. He sang, "I've broken in half just to learn how to bend." It was, by all accounts, the most vulnerable thing he had ever recorded. Those who heard it live described the silence after the final note as sacred. "You could feel everyone realizing," one concertgoer said, "that he wasn't just singing his story, he was singing ours." That became the strange miracle of Keith Urban's tragedy. It wasn't the collapse of a life, but the revelation of one. He stopped chasing applause. He stopped performing for survival. For the first time since childhood, he began to understand the stillness between the notes. By then, Nicole and Keith had reached an unspoken peace. They co-parented with grace, celebrated birthdays together, exchanged quiet smiles at family gatherings. There were no harsh words, no tabloid explosions, just two people who had walked through the fire and chosen not to let it burn what was left. In Nashville, friends began to describe him differently: lighter, calmer, freer. "He used to live for the stage," one producer said. "Now he lives for the mornings after." He still played, still wrote, still toured, but everything was quieter now. The tragedy that once looked like an ending had revealed itself as transformation. When a journalist asked him, "What do you think it all meant, the fame, the love, the loss?" Keith paused for a long moment, then smiled. "It's all just music, isn't it?" he said. "The mistakes, The miracles, they're all part of the same song. You just keep playing. And in that single sentence, the myth unraveled and the man remained. By the time Keith Urban turned 57, something remarkable had happened. The noise had stopped. Not the applause, not the tours, but the noise inside him. The endless self-questioning, the need to prove, the anxiety of maintaining perfection. For the first time in his adult life, he could breathe without the weight of expectation pressing against his ribs. He didn't call it peace, he called it stillness. In interviews, he appeared softer, his laughter slower, his tone almost meditative. The chaos that once drove his art had become something quieter, wiser. When I was young, he said during a late-night podcast in 2024, I thought success would fix everything. Then I learned it just amplifies what's already broken. Now I don't want to be fixed. I want to be real. In Nashville, he became almost mythic in his simplicity. No entourage, no ego. Just Keith driving his old truck through back roads, stopping for coffee at the same diner where local musicians played on weekends. He'd still jam with them sometimes, sitting in the corner with an acoustic guitar, blending into the sound like another regular soul. The bartender once said, "You'd never know he was a superstar. He tips like a gentleman and listens like a friend." He wasn't retired, not exactly, but his relationship with fame had changed. He had stopped chasing the chart toppers and focused instead on authenticity. His later albums were raw, unvarnished, almost minimalist, just voice, guitar, and truth. The Hard Way Home, released quietly online without any major promotion, became a cult favorite. Critics called it his most human work, the musical equivalent of a deep exhale. Off stage, he dedicated himself to mentorship, opening small songwriting retreats outside Nashville where young artists could gather, learn, and unlearn. You can't teach soul, he'd tell them, but you can teach honesty. The rest follows. Many said those retreats felt more like therapy than music classes. As for Nicole, the world still speculated, of course. Every photo, every passing quote became clickbait, but those close to them said there was no drama left to chase. The love between them had transformed into a kind of familial grace. They co-parented beautifully, celebrated milestones with laughter and nostalgia. At their daughter's school recitals, they often sat side by side, smiling not as a couple defined by romance, but as parents defined by devotion. In one candid interview, Keith was asked if he still loved her. He smiled, eyes soft. "You don't stop loving someone like that," he said. "You just start loving them differently." That sentence rippled through the internet like poetry, clipped, reposted, reinterpreted, but the truth behind it was simple. Love had evolved into gratitude. He no longer measured life in awards or sales or streaming numbers. He measured it in mornings. The mornings he woke up sober. The mornings he walked barefoot across his porch, coffee in hand, listening to birds instead of applause. "I used to live for the show," he said. "Now I live for the silence after it." Friends noticed that even his music had changed rhythm. The anthems had become lullabies. The fire had become warmth. His performances, though fewer, carried the sacred hush of communion. Fans didn't scream as much anymore. They listened. You could almost feel the shared understanding that this was no longer entertainment. It was testimony. When asked about legacy, Keith shrugged. "I don't care if they remember the hits," he said. "I just hope they remember the honesty." He still lives in Nashville, in a modest home surrounded by trees and the hum of cicadas. The guitars line the walls not as trophies but as old friends resting. He writes, he teaches, he breathes. The boy who once thought happiness lived in applause had found it in the quiet strum of an old six-string beneath an open sky. And sometimes, when the night air is still and the stars hang low, neighbors say they can hear him playing softly the same chords he learned as a child, the same melody that's carried him through every rise and fall. Because in the end, Keith Urban never stopped singing. He just stopped pretending. In the grand chronicle of modern music, Keith Urban's name doesn't just sit beside legends, it bridges them. He became a living link between country's twang of honesty and rock's restless heart, between the golden past of Nashville and its global genre-blending future. What makes his legacy hauntingly beautiful isn't his record sales or awards. It's that his story mirrors the very songs he wrote, broken, brave, and endlessly human. To his fans, Keith was never just a musician. He was a translator turning pain into melody, loneliness into communion. In his hands, the guitar was not an instrument but a confession booth. His songs reminded millions that heartbreak could be a form of prayer, that beauty could survive failure. Even now, when somebody like you, or You'll Think of Me, plays on a radio somewhere, there's a quiet pause, the kind of pause that comes when truth still knows how to sting. Among fellow musicians, his influence runs deep. For 2 decades, Urban redefined what country music could sound like. He blurred boundaries with fearless ease, sliding between pedal steel and electric riffs, between intimacy and spectacle. He made it okay for country to be emotional again, said fellow artist Brad Paisley. He played like a rocker, but he felt like a poet. Younger artists still cite him as their North Star. For them, Keith isn't just a benchmark of talent, but of endurance, a man who fell, confessed, rose, and kept creating without shame. Many of his protégés at his songwriting retreats recall how he would strip away their metaphors and ask one question: where's the truth in this line? That was the Urban method: precision, not of sound, but of soul. Beyond music, his cultural impact extends into the conversation around vulnerability. At a time when fame demanded armor, Keith chose transparency. His public openness about addiction and emotional recovery reframed what strength could look like in the modern age. He didn't glorify survival. He dissected it. Recovery, he said once, isn't about becoming perfect. It's about learning to live honestly with the parts of you that aren't. Those words resonated far beyond the music world, quoted in therapy circles, printed on social posts, tattooed on arms. Even in his relationship with Nicole Kidman, one of the most scrutinized love stories in celebrity history, Keith gave the world something rare: dignity. When it ended, he refused bitterness, refused spectacle. He turned silence into grace, heartbreak into gratitude. That quiet refusal to weaponize pain became part of his legend. It was proof that kindness could outlast chaos. In the broader arc of entertainment, Keith Urban became an emblem of the second act, that elusive space where fame doesn't end but transforms. Like Johnny Cash before him, or Bruce Springsteen in his twilight, Keith's later years offered something deeper than brilliance: wisdom. His music evolved from anthems to meditations, from rhythm to reflection. Each song became a diary entry left open for others to read. Critics, once quick to call him country pop's golden boy, now write about his work with reverence. He isn't chasing hits anymore, wrote Rolling Stone. He's chasing truth and finding it. In museums and music halls, his guitars are displayed not as relics of celebrity, but as artifacts of survival. There's something poetic about how his legacy circles back to where it began. A boy alone in a small Australian living room, tracing the frets of a guitar as if it were a map. That boy believed that music could save him, and in saving himself, he unknowingly saved others. Every time he played, he gave listeners permission to hurt, to hope, to heal. His story now belongs to more than just Nashville. It belongs to anyone who has ever loved too much, lost too hard, or lived long enough to learn that peace doesn't come from applause, it comes from forgiveness. And perhaps that is his greatest cultural gift. Not the awards, not the fame, but the reminder that art, at its purest, is not about performance. It's about honesty whispered loudly enough to outlive the noise. Because when Keith Urban finally stopped trying to be a legend, he became something better. A mirror through which millions could see themselves and realize that even broken songs can still sound whole. There's something about Keith Urban's story that feels almost cinematic, but not in the glossy Hollywood sense. It's the kind of film that starts in silence, unravels in pain, and ends with a man sitting alone in soft light, finally understanding what the noise was all for. His life defies the easy binaries that fame often demands. He's neither saint nor sinner, not hero nor cautionary tale. He's something rarer real. When we look back at Keith Urban's journey, what stands out isn't his fame, but his evolution. This is a man who turned every downfall into a verse and every scar into a chord. He didn't just survive the industry, he reshaped it from within, blending rock and country until both learned to speak the same emotional language. While others chased spotlight and spectacle, Keith chased sincerity, and he caught it. The tragedy of his story isn't in loss, it's in the quiet realization that even the deepest love can't always sustain under the weight of time and expectation. Watching Keith and Nicole together was like watching sunlight reflected on water, luminous but fleeting. It wasn't failure, it was transformation. Their love didn't die. It evolved into gratitude, into family, into something that outlived romance. That kind of grace is almost extinct in celebrity culture, a world addicted to scandal and soundbites. Keith refused to feed that machine. When others turned their heartbreak into headlines, he turned his into harmony. That choice, more than any award, defines his legacy. Because what he gave us wasn't gossip, it was wisdom. His interviews in recent years feel less like celebrity press and more like philosophy. When he says, happiness isn't applause, it's being able to go home and sit with yourself. It's not a line crafted for sympathy, it's truth. A truth that strips away illusion, that forces us to look at our own lives and ask, what are we chasing and why? Keith Urban represents something profoundly human, the idea that peace isn't found in arrival, but in surrender. He spent decades performing for the world, only to learn that the world can never give you what you refuse to give yourself. Acceptance. It's a lesson that reaches far beyond music, touching anyone who has ever hidden behind their own ambition. It's also what makes his silence so powerful now. The absence of spectacle is the statement, no messy tell-all memoir, no grand rebranding, just a man who continues to play, quietly, honestly, for whoever still needs to listen. For fans who have followed him from the beginning, the emotional arc feels personal, as if we've grown alongside him. We danced to Somebody Like You, cried to You'll Think of Me, and healed through Blue Ain't Your Color. Each song was a timestamp in our own stories. And now, in his stillness, there's an invitation to stop, breathe, and listen to what's left when the world goes quiet. Perhaps that's why Keith Urban feels timeless. He never pretended to be untouchable. His mistakes were public, his redemption untheatrical. He didn't demand forgiveness, he earned peace, and in doing so, he left behind not a myth, but a mirror. So when people ask, what is the tragedy of Keith Urban? Maybe it's that we expected a fall, when what we witnessed was a metamorphosis. Maybe the heartbreak isn't his, it's ours, for realizing how rare it is to see someone walk away from fame without bitterness. Keith Urban reminds us that sometimes the bravest act isn't surviving the storm, it's stepping out of it and learning to live in the quiet that follows. And maybe that's why his story still lingers long after the final note. It's not about music anymore. It's about meaning, about what remains when the applause fades and only truth stays behind. There's a certain stillness in the air when Keith Urban walks off stage these days. No dramatic bows, no grand finales, just a quiet man stepping into the dark, guitar still humming faintly like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. The crowd roars, but he doesn't linger to soak it in. He's learned that applause, like fame, is just another echo. What matters is the silence that follows the part that belongs only to him. He once said, every song I've ever written was just my way of saying, I'm still here. Maybe that's what his music has always been, not performance, but proof. Proof that even broken things can sing, that love can transform rather than disappear, that forgiveness is a melody all its own. It's easy to mythologize a man like Keith Urban, to turn him into an idea, a symbol of resilience, a headline softened by nostalgia. But the truth is simpler, and therefore more haunting. He was a boy who dreamed with his father's guitar, a man who loved too deeply, and an artist who kept trying to turn pain into beauty. The tragedy of Keith Urban was never in losing love or fame. It was in how long it took him to realize that he didn't need to earn peace. He just had to stop running. Somewhere between the glare of the spotlight and the quiet hum of an old Nashville night, he found it. Now, when the world mentions his name, it isn't with the fever of gossip, but with the reverence of memory. His songs linger in coffee shops, car radios, late-night playlists, small ghosts of an artist who learned that truth doesn't age. Each note, each lyric, each confession still whispers, you can survive yourself. And somewhere, maybe on a porch where the cicadas sing and the Tennessee air smells like rain, Keith still plays. Not for the crowd, not for redemption. Just because the music never really left him, and maybe it never will. The sky above him stretches wide, the same one that hung over Caboolture when he was a barefoot boy with a dream too big for his town. He strums softly, eyes half closed, as if tracing the outline of every life he's lived. Every chord carries a lifetime. The hunger, the heartbreak, the healing, all blending into something wordless and eternal. Somewhere, perhaps, Nicole hears it too. Maybe she hums along under another sky, remembering the song they once shared. Because some melodies don't end. They just change key. And that's the quiet brilliance of Keith Urban's story. It doesn't close. It fades like the last note of a song that refuses to die, carried softly on the wind, reminding us that peace is not silence. It's music that never stops playing. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,